The film opens with a tense scene where a doctor named Gisu is desperately trying to bring his deceased daughter back to life. Over the years, he's conducted countless experiments, using reptiles like lizards, snakes, and land crocodiles as test subjects. He even goes as far as killing his assistant, who tries to stop him, though Gisu had to be stopped. His experiments had broken hospital rules and government laws. At least he hadn't broken any election rules. Despite everything, Gisu eventually succeeds in bringing his daughter back to life, though she's not fully revived, only capable of opening and closing her eyes. Not long after, his superior arrives with a special forces unit tasked with arresting him. But before they can, Gisu injects himself with the experimental serum, determined to prove his work wasn't in vain. The special forces team thinks he's completely lost it, seeing him as a mad scientist obsessed with power. But just as they move to apprehend him, an unexpected and massive earthquake strikes. The entire city crumbles, leaving countless dead in its wake. Soon after, it's revealed that the earthquake wasn't just local, it had happened globally, marking a grim prelude to the apocalypse. 3 years pass, and the world is completely changed. The population has dwindled due to extreme drought and famine. As the earthquake wiped out all food and water sources, humanity is forced to survive by any means necessary, even resorting to cannibalism. Others, like a young man named Jiwan, hunt wild beasts for food. Jiwan is seen taking aim at a massive land crocodile with a fire-tipped arrow. When the crocodile falls, Jiwan cautiously approaches to ensure it's truly dead, but it isn't. The creature leaps up, chasing him down. Suddenly, a familiar figure appears, an older man, one we all know well. He grabs the crocodile by the tail and wrestles the beast with raw, brutal force. This man is none other than Namsan, played by the legendary Ma Dong-seok, aka Don Lee. Then, we are introduced to a beautiful young woman named Suna, who, despite not having bathed in 3 years, still manages to look radiant and captivating. She lives in a simple hut with her grandmother, who has been her guardian ever since the massive earthquake 3 years ago wiped out their entire family. Since that day, Suna and her grandmother have survived together, eventually making their way to a village where the locals help each other out. The village is well organized, with a filtration system to clean dirty water available to everyone. They even have a marketplace where people barter for food and goods, like Namsan and Jiwan, who sell the crocodile meat they've just hunted. Because the global economy has collapsed, the village has returned to a barter system. Much like in ancient times, gold and jewelry no longer hold any value. So when a widow tries to offer Namsan some jewelry in exchange for crocodile tail, he refuses. Shortly after, Suna and her grandmother arrive to buy meat from Namsan. And here we learn that Namsan was the one who saved Suna during the earthquake. Since then, Suna has looked up to Namsan as her uncle. However, the peaceful village life is soon disrupted by a group of ragtag gangsters riding in post-apocalyptic cars, arriving from a place called Spalin. Hilariously, they claim to be police officers, even though the government collapsed 3 years ago. The gangsters start rounding up villagers, accusing them of being criminals. But their real aim is more sinister. They want to capture Suna because she's young, beautiful, and a dream girl for any guy, especially Gemini types. Seeing this, Jiwan refuses to stand by and does everything in his power to protect Suna, the girl he deeply cares for. Unfortunately, he's quickly overwhelmed by the gangsters and beaten to a pulp. But just when things seem hopeless, Namsan steps in once again. He lands a powerful punch on one of the gangsters, sending him flying. This of course enrages the rest of the gang, and they all attack Namsan at once. As usual though, Namsan only needs his bare fist to take down every one of them, effortlessly defeating the entire crew. After that, Namsan interrogates one of the gangsters, who turns out to be a henchman of Namsan's enemy, a man named Tiger. When the gangsters realize Namsan's identity, they are immediately filled with fear. During the interrogation, Namsan notices a bottle of clean water belonging to one of the thugs, a guy named Jamet. Surprised, Namsan asks where Jamet got the water. Jamet explains that he found it in an apartment building that miraculously remained intact after the earthquake. Apparently, it's the only structure still standing, solid and undamaged. After hearing this, Namsan lets the gangsters go, but warns them never to come near his village again. As the gangsters leave, Jiwan suggests to Namsan that they should check out the apartment the gangsters mentioned. However, Namsan is skeptical about their story. While they're talking, they suddenly spot some well-dressed people visiting Suna's shack, where she lives with her grandmother. Feeling suspicious, Namsan and Jiwan approach them, and it turns out that the visitors are residents of the apartment, inviting Suna and her grandmother to come live with them. One of the visitors introduces herself as a teacher, explaining that her job is to educate the Korean children who survived the earthquake. She insists that this is all for the future of the country. The teacher explains to Suna and her grandmother that the apartment has plenty of food and clean water, so Suna could take better care of her grandmother there. Not only that, but Suna could also go to school with other teenagers. After hearing this, Suna and her grandmother decide to accept the offer and prepare to leave. Before leaving, they bid farewell to Namsan and Jiwan. As a parting gift, Suna gives Jiwan a drawing of him hunting a wild animal, which instantly lifts Jiwan's spirits. That night, Jiwan again urges Namsan to come with them to the apartment, but Namsan refuses once more. He says the apartment is only for selected people, and that the villagers still need him, so he chooses to stay behind, even though he's visibly sad about Suna's departure. Suna, after all, looks so much like his late daughter. Meanwhile, Suna and her grandmother reach the pickup point, where soldiers assigned to guard the apartment come to escort them. At this point, Suna meets a girl named Juye, who is her age. Like Suna, Juye and her family were invited to live in the apartment after surviving in an uncomfortable underground shelter. After walking for some time, Suna's grandmother begins to grow tired, so the teacher asks the soldiers to take the elderly to a nearby clinic, while Suna and Juye are to be escorted directly to the apartment by a team led by a senior soldier. Let's call him Sergeant Khan. However, something about Khan makes Suna uneasy. She notices his strange behavior, and more worryingly, a scar behind his ear, which makes her even more suspicious. Meanwhile, the soldiers weren't taking Grandma Suna to the clinic as promised. Instead, they led her and other elderly people to the edge of a cliff. At that very moment, Namsan and Jiwan, who were out hunting, stumbled upon the scene. Without wasting any time, Namsan quickly took down the two soldiers with his trusty machete, but to their shock, the soldiers got back up like zombies and began attacking Namsan with wild, uncontrollable rage. In the ensuing fight, Namsan managed to hold one soldier off, while Jiwan struggled to defend himself. Luckily, the soldier pursuing Jiwan stepped into a trap, leaving his leg suspended in mid-air. But in a gruesome twist, the soldier cut off his own leg to free himself and continued the attack on Jiwan. Just as things seemed dire, a mysterious woman appeared and helped Namsan and Jiwan. With her assistance, Namsan was able to finish off the soldiers by decapitating them. After the brutal fight, Namsan invited Jiwan to help bury Grandma Suna in disputed land, saying a prayer to ensure her soul could rest peacefully with God. Once they finished, they turned to the mysterious woman, who revealed herself to be Sergeant Lee, a soldier with extraordinary combat skills. She wasn't just any soldier though. Her abilities were on another level. Lee explained that the zombie soldiers they had just fought were once her subordinates in the special forces. She also revealed that the legend apartments people talked about were extremely dangerous. To make everything clear, Lee then flashbacked to the previous year when she and Khan, her former ally, were still part of the same unit. At the time, their mission was to find survivors of the earthquake and evacuate them to a safer place. Eventually, they stumbled upon an apartment building that had withstood the quake. Deciding to settle there, they started taking care of the survivors. Among those who came to the apartment was none other than Dr. Yang Gisu, miraculously alive, and not a scratch on him, even though he and his daughter had been crushed by the hospital building at the start of the film. Shortly after Gisu's arrival, Lee began noticing strange things happening. Young people were mysteriously disappearing. It turned out Gisu was using them to create a zombie serum, an experiment aimed at making himself immortal without needing food or water. Gisu also shared the serum with Khan, turning them into unstoppable killing machines. Still clinging to her sense of morality, Lee rebelled and fled the apartment, knowing she couldn't take them all down alone. But now, she wanted to return to save the remaining youths and needed Namsan's help. Namsan, without hesitation, agreed to assist Lee. He also wanted to save Suna, who had just arrived at the apartment complex with her family. Little did they know, Gisu had already been declared the leader of the apartment, making all the rules for the residents. The people had no idea who he really was, as Gisu always acted kindly in front of them. After welcoming Suna and the other newcomers, Gisu ordered his soldiers to escort them to their rooms. Rumor had it that the apartment had access to clean water, making it even more of a coveted refuge. On the other side, Namsan, Jiwan, and Lee were busy crafting a plan to infiltrate the apartment. According to Lee, the only way in was through the basement, but Namsan, cautious as ever, refused to rush in. Instead, he decided to seek help from a gang boss who frequently moved in and out of the area. The only problem? This gang boss, Tiger, was Namsan's old nemesis. Upon seeing Namsan, Tiger couldn't help but bring up their shared past. They were once the top professional boxing athletes in Korea, but one fateful day, Namsan's punch forced Tiger to retire from the sport for good. Hearing this, Namsan challenged Tiger to a rematch, just like the old days. However, Tiger rejected the offer and instead teamed up with his men to ambush Namsan and his friends. Unfazed by the threat, Namsan was confident he could take them all down. And without hesitation, he launched into action with an epic display of skill, swiftly defeating all of Tiger's henchmen in a matter of seconds. After clearing the room, they even managed to free all the hostages Tiger's gang had kidnapped. Meanwhile, Tiger pretended to pass out to avoid being beaten by Namsan. Once Tiger and his gang regained consciousness, Namsan interrogated them one by one about the legend apartments. When none of the answers satisfied him, Namsan knocked each of them out again, leaving only Tiger. With no other choice, Tiger finally confessed that he had been kidnapping young people to send to the apartment in exchange for clean water. Hearing this, Lee and Jiwan were furious and wanted to beat Tiger senseless, but Tiger defended his actions, claiming he did it all just to survive. Realizing there was no other way, Tiger revealed the best method to infiltrate the apartment. The plan? To pose as kidnappers delivering victims. When they arrived, Tiger claimed to be bringing a few young people for Gisu. Unfortunately, the soldiers didn't trust him, forcing Namsan to go with Plan B, ramming through the gate with full force. As soon as they broke in, the four of them were immediately swarmed by zombie soldiers. With no other option, they grabbed weapons they had taken from Tiger's base and fought their way through with brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, a teacher reported the intrusion to Gisu, just as Namsan and his team made their way to the lower floors. However, Gisu was preoccupied. He was in the middle of performing surgery on Suna. Downstairs, Namsan and the others entered the basement to rescue Lee's team, who had been imprisoned by Khan. But to their horror, they discovered that all of Lee's soldiers had already turned into zombies, their bodies overloaded with serum. Even worse, their tongues had mutated into snake-like appendages. Without a second thought, Namsan took action, swiftly punishing the zombies, reassuring Lee that these creatures were no longer human. A fierce battle erupted, but for Namsan, this was just another fight. His combat experience made him more than capable of wiping out all the zombies in record time. Soon after, Gisu made an announcement over the speaker system, ordering Khan's forces to prepare to eliminate Namsan. But Namsan wasn't intimidated in the slightest. In fact, he boldly declared that he would kill everyone involved in the kidnapping of Suna and the murder of her grandmother. His resolve was stronger than ever. As Namsan made his way to another room, he and his group quickly grabbed weapons from Khan's fallen men. However, their victory was short-lived as they found themselves suddenly surrounded by soldiers. Namsan, staying calm, ordered Jiwan and Lee to find Suna, while he stayed behind to deal with the army. In mere seconds, Namsan tore through the thousands of soldiers with ease, using his unmatched combat skills. Meanwhile, Jiwan and Lee were struggling with their own foes, who were incredibly difficult to kill. Despite the challenges, Lee refused to give up and managed to take down the enemy with her remaining bullets. She then hurried to follow Jiwan, who had already gone upstairs, but before she could reach him, Khan ambushed her. Unfortunately, Khan's strength had doubled due to the new serum created by Gisu, making him almost unstoppable. He easily overpowered Lee and offered her a chance to join Gisu's side, but Lee rejected the offer outright. Even with all her efforts, Lee's attacks barely affected Khan. In a gruesome display, Khan ripped the skin from his face, revealing one of his eyes had turned into a snake's eye, granting him even more power. He viciously defeated Lee, leaving her badly injured. Meanwhile, Jiwan broke into a classroom, quickly taking down the guards inside. But as he entered, he was startled to see all the students staring at him blankly. Wasting no time, Jiwan pointed his gun at the teacher, forcing her to take him to Gisu's room. But just as they were about to leave, Khan appeared, blocking their way. Thankfully, Namsan arrived just in time. He ordered Jiwan to go save Suna while he stayed behind to face Khan. What followed was an intense, bloody battle. Khan managed to slam Namsan's head into the wall, almost bringing the building down. But despite the brutal hit, Namsan fought back, eventually turning the tide in his favor. Meanwhile, the students and all the residents of the apartment began fleeing after learning the truth about Gisu's crimes. At the same time, Gisu injected Suna with a new serum, derived from his experiments, and spoke to her, promising that he would soon find the perfect body for her. But suddenly, Gisu began feeling excruciating pain, noticing strange wounds appearing on his neck. It turned out that because Suna hadn't been drinking the apartment's water, the serum inside her body failed. Enraged, Gisu prepared to kill Suna, but before he could act, Jiwan burst in, pointing his rifle at him. Unfortunately, one of Gisu's men knocked Jiwan out from behind, disarming him. Gisu then ordered his lackeys to pack Suna into a suitcase, intending to flee with her. But just as they were about to leave, Namsan arrived, swiftly taking out Gisu's henchmen. Realizing the situation was hopeless, Gisu attempted to escape on his own, leaving behind the teacher, who turned out to be bald under her wig. In desperation, Gisu threw a grenade into the lab, but Jiwan shielded Suna from the blast, saving them both. Namsan then helped the two escape the building. On the other side, Lee regained consciousness and immediately rushed to capture Gisu. However, she didn't need to act because the apartment residents had already surrounded the deranged doctor, beating him relentlessly. But then, Gisu's face suddenly became covered in snake-like scales, terrifying the crowd. Rising again, Gisu opened fire on everyone around him, but in his reckless shooting, he accidentally killed his own daughter, Suna. Grief-stricken, Gisu hesitated as Suna appeared in a vision, telling him that his actions were no different from a psychopathic killer. Enraged by her words, Gisu turned his gun towards Suna, but before he could pull the trigger, he was killed in a gruesome manner. Shortly after Gisu's death, rain suddenly began to pour down, ending the 3-year-long drought. With the battle over, Lee decided to stay at the apartment and help the remaining residents rebuild their lives. As for Namsan, Jiwan, and Suna, they chose to return to their village. But before heading home, Namsan took Suna to her grandmother's grave, where Suna broke down, crying hysterically, unable to accept her loss. In the film's final scene, Namsan, Jiwan, and Suna are shown living peacefully in the village, running a humble pork shop alongside the other villagers. Despite all the chaos they had been through, they finally found happiness in the quiet simplicity of village life. And with that, the film ends.